And you know, what our critics try and do, the politically motivated critics, is when they pick off a few things in our book, pretending ours is the only evidence of relationship, I want to just say, okay, if I show you this graph of the provinces of China, which ones do you want to take off to make the relationship disappear? And what, you could go on with that for ages. The other important point, though, is that how countries get their greater equality is quite different. Take, for example, Sweden and Japan down here. Incidentally, remember how culturally they're at opposite ends of the poles in terms of the position of women, or how closely they keep to the nuclear family, or the political participation of women. They're almost equal in Sweden, but absolutely the opposite in Japan. But Swedes have very big differences in earnings, and they redistribute with taxes and benefits. And they have a big welfare state. That's how they get their greater equality. But Japan is very different. It starts off with smaller differences before tax, has lower taxes, does less redistribution, has a smaller welfare state. And yet they both end up fairly equal, and it seems to confer the benefits. We find just the same contrast amongst the American states. There are some that do it with more redistribution, there are some that do it with less. So New Hampshire is a state that performs particularly well, not the best, but amongst the top half dozen in the states. It has lower state taxation and lower public social expenditure than any state except Alaska. And that's because they start off with small income differences. I don't know why, but one of the things I've discovered recently is that they have strong legislation protecting trade union rights. For instance, you're not allowed to try and get employees to sign a contract banning trade union membership. And it's illegal to organise strike breaking. There are some papers we found that suggest that stronger trade unions are a fairly common aspect of more equal societies, so I don't know whether that's the explanation of why New Hampshire does well, despite its low taxes and government expenditure. I should just say a little bit about why we're so sensitive to inequality. I can't remember. Yes, I guess I've got 5 minutes. Because my background is health inequalities, trying to understand social determinants of health, the big change over the last, 25 years or so in how we understand the drivers of public health in the rich countries is how important psychosocial factors are. Really around chronic stress. Epidemiology started having evidence that chronic stress mattered long before biologists could tell us why. I remember them saying, okay, it might make a small difference to immunity, but not enough to make noticeable differences. But now, increasingly, people do understand the effects of chronic stress on the immune system, the cardiovascular system, and indeed many others. And every now and then you hear people comparing chronic stress to more rapid aging. It makes you more vulnerable to a whole range of health problems. But it seems to me that the main groups of psychosocial risk factor for poor health are things to do with low social status, which can sometimes be demonstrated in some monkey species, even when you can control out the effects of material differences. So you've just got the ranking system, you're keeping them in the same compounds, giving them the same food and so on. Almost any measure of friendship seems to be protective of health. Whether you're talking about close relationships with a partner, a good relationship is protective, or whether you're talking about the number of friends you've got, or whether you're involved in community life, and not only in observational studies, but also experiments. And people have done things like making little puncture wounds on the back of the hands of volunteers, and they heal more slowly in people who have bad relationships with their partners. a number of experiments of that kind, as well as the observational studies, but also the other major group, I think, of factors is around stress in early life. And that's partly the sort of biological side of what I suppose psychologists have always said about the importance of early childhood for shaping the child's development. But also it now looks as if maternal stress in pregnancy affects fetal development. People talk about tuning of stress responses and so on. But it seemed to me all those things might be reflecting a similar underlying sort of what I called, well, psychologists call social anxiety. That the insecurities that you might have from low social status, maybe a feeling you're not valued, anxiety, insecurity and so on, are rather like those sorts of feelings that might come from a difficult early childhood. You know, not being valued and so on. And friendship fits into that because, you know, if you have friends, you feel better about yourself. People appreciate you. Whereas if people ignore you, avoid you, don't include you in things, we all have those self-doubts that come, well, not creeping in, but usually flooding in, fearing we're unattractive or boring or socially gauche or stupid or whatever. And so I suspect that's what underlies these things. And indeed, I found fairly soon after I'd suggested that interpretation, a paper where they went through all sorts of studies that psychologists had done with volunteers, making them do stressful things while measuring the levels of stress hormones. Sometimes they would make them do, I don't know, mathematical problems. Sometimes they'd have to read their marks at the end with, you know, a little bit of extra embarrassment if they were bad. Sometimes you'd have to write about an unpleasant experience you'd had. Sometimes you'd be videoed while you're doing any of these. But what the meta-analysis of those studies was trying to see is which kind of stressors most reliably raise stress hormones. And they found that they were looking principally at cortisol, which you can measure in blood or saliva. And they found that the things that really push it up are tasks that include social evaluative threat. In the paper they say threats to social status or self-esteem in which others can judge you negatively. Almost exactly like the way I was suggesting we should interpret these powerful groups of psychosocial risk factors. And of course it does explain why violence is more common in more unequal countries. It's not the poor attacking the rich. It's violence triggered by people feeling devalued, looked down on, shamed, humiliated. This is an American prison psychiatrist talking, emphasizing that point. I'll skip over these things, but this is what's happened to inequality. From the late 70s it started to move up slowly and then very rapidly in the later 1980s, and then little ups and downs. I sometimes point out that Brown's budgets were almost all redistributionary from rich to poor, but the little bit of good he did was lost by the widening income differences at the top, the underlying widening of earnings differences. So you can say he may have stopped it getting worse, but he didn't manage to do anything about undoing this. And I think what we experience in our society today is the long-term effects of this, making our society more sort of antisocial. I think status competition and consumerism increase, and all sorts of other things with that. So, in the book, each problem has a chapter to itself. So there's a chapter on obesity, a chapter on violence, a chapter on drugs, shows the data in both those settings and talks about the likely pathways. But I do think that, and if you want to talk about this with people, you can download most of our slides from the Equality Trust website. for some local groups. I think Roundtree gave us money to campaign on this, so that's what we've been doing. But, you know, the real take-home message is that for the vast majority of the population, how we should now be trying to improve the real quality of life is not by status competition and consumerism, which is such a threat to the environment, but by improving the quality of social relations. And what this data says is that we can improve the quality of social relations throughout society by reducing the inequalities between us. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. But powerful and convincing stuff, and coming on from the presentation from Ilaria this morning from the market review team. You know, we've had the sort of broad global scope. We've had more of a focus on the kind of national inequalities. There have been discussions within the workshop groups around inequalities within the Southwest, and I know there's been discussions in reference to inequalities within places within the Southwest. So we've been, as a colleague was saying earlier after the presentation from Ilaria, kind of smacked in the face, I think, by some very clear evidence, and doubly so now. So thank you very much, Richard. Powerful stuff. So we have some time for some comments, observations and questions, which I think you're happy to take. Shall we take a couple at a time? Would that make sense? Or one?
If you remind me the ones I forget.
Okay, well maybe we'll do it just one-on-one, actually. That may make life simpler for everybody. So let's just get a quick scope from people. So I see some hands going up. So, okay, Claire first, and then Ilaria.
Claire Hall, previously a trustee of Southwest Forum. Richard, I've read your book quite carefully, and I had to reread it after David Cameron made his first statement about what a wonderful book it was, just in case I'd misunderstood it. And I'm intrigued by the fact that what you concentrated on so much is income inequality and not wealth. And I wonder whether you have done any work on wealth and where that would next take us.
There haven't been figures available to compare wealth inequalities in different countries. The Luxembourg income study, which actually is where, for these countries, the UN and the World Bank gets its income inequality figures, they started a while ago a Luxembourg wealth study to allow us to make comparisons. But there are only the initial attempts to make them comparable available for rather few countries. So we didn't look at that. But I don't know whether, I do think income is the key to consumption. I agree that wealth is an important support for sense of security. You know, if you've got a decent cushion under you. But that's the reason why. Also, it's why we don't use other measures of social status differentiation. You can't, and I did show you that Swedes had classified some of their deaths by our social class classification, but that was a huge amount of work, and you can't get that done everywhere for all these outcomes. And sorry, even if you did, the point is that in a way we're talking about how big the difference is between one class and another. And class systems have no way of measuring the distance between each class. So income is a useful thing like that.
Ilaria Geddes from the Marmor Review team. When we were working on the review, when we were developing policy recommendations, we were asked all the time to prioritize. And we thought that was quite hard because we thought that action was needed on all determinants of health. But we did say that the early years were very, very important. And you pointed out that children's well-being in the UK was the one thing that was worse than in the USA.
Yes.
I was wondering whether you thought there was any other factor at play other than inequality that would influence the fact that children's well-being was worse in the UK, given that there is much more inequality in the US.
Well, our income inequality is not so far short of the US now. I was about to say something about the ethnic mix and the threat of violence in the US, which I think means that everyone has to be rather careful of each other in a way that I think they don't in Britain. So I think that you can get more bullying and so on, more open hostility amongst kids. And one of the measures that the Index of Child Wellbeing, where Britain does do particularly badly, is conflict between children. We have a graph of bullying, child conflict, and kids saying that their kids are not kind and helpful. But I don't really know why we do badly. We did a paper in the British Medical Journal going through all the components of that index and finding as many similar components as we could for the American states, showing whether they're related to average income of each country in each state and their relationships with inequality. I think the only thing that's, well, only in the States is related to average income is teenage births, but everything else much more really powerfully related to inequality. No, I don't have a good answer. I'm sorry.